May 13, 2026. Donald Trump touches down in China. It's the first time in 9 years an American president has visited the country. What does he want to talk about? What is he trying to get? Honestly, he probably doesn't even know himself. But one thing is for sure, China's pushback in the trade war has seriously stung the US. It's knocked Trump off his high horse and forced him to the table to seek cooperation. To really understand why this visit is such a big deal, we have to look back at history. Over the last half-century, U.S.-China relations have been a roller coaster, from the Cold War standoff to a historic handshake, through an era of globalization and teamwork, all the way to today's fierce competition and geopolitical chess. The 1970s, breaking the ice. This presidential visit shines a light on how the relationship between the two nations has evolved over different eras. Back in the 1970s, during the Cold War, the global landscape was shifting. The US was bogged down in the Vietnam War, which sparked massive anti-war protests back home. On top of that, the federal government was dealing with a massive budget deficit and skyrocketing inflation. Feeling the squeeze from all sides, America started looking across the Pacific toward China. On February 21, 1972, President Richard Nixon flew into Beijing on Air Force One. Stepping off the plane, Nixon reached out and shook hands with Premier Zhou Enlai, a moment so iconic it belongs in a museum. That trip was dubbed the week that changed the world, and it officially ended 22 years of bad blood between the two countries. On February 28th, the US and China issued the Shanghai Communique. In it, the US acknowledged that all Chinese people on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. This laid the political groundwork for normalizing relations, and the two nations started working together based on shared strategic interests. After Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandal, President Gerald Ford visited China in December 1975, backing up the principles of the Shanghai Communique. With the US and the Soviet Union battling for global dominance, this move stabilized US-China relations and paved the way for official diplomatic ties. 4 years later, the US and China officially established diplomatic relations. That same January, Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping visited the US, kicking off an era of full-scale engagement. The 1980s and 90s, opening up and globalization. Rolling into the 1980s, China launched its economic reforms and opened its doors to the world, putting a laser focus on economic growth. In April 1984, Ronald Reagan visited China, becoming the first sitting US president to do so since diplomatic ties were established. During his 6-day trip, Reagan visited Beijing, Xi'an, and Shanghai. He signed agreements to prevent double taxation and promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Reagan's trip was a turning point, expanding the relationship into real, practical areas like trade and tech exchanges. George H.W. Bush followed suit with a quick visit just a month after taking office. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Cold War ended, the US and China entered a bit of a honeymoon phase. In 1994, Bill Clinton laid out a strategy of comprehensive engagement with China. 4 years later, he took a massive 9-day trip to the country, speaking at Peking University and publicly reaffirming the three no's policy on Taiwan while in Shanghai. Under Clinton's watch, the US backed China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001. This kicked off a whole new chapter of economic globalization for both countries. The 2000s, curveballs and cooperation. Stepping into the 21st century, China's economy was booming. As China flexed its growing capabilities, tensions started simmering just beneath the surface. But for the first dozen years or so, a few unexpected global curveballs actually hit pause on a full-blown US-China showdown. When George W. Bush took office in early 2001, he made it clear China was a strategic competitor. That April, a US spy plane flying near Hainan Island collided with a Chinese J-8 fighter jet. After the crash, tensions went through the roof. But just months later, 9/11 happened. The US completely pivoted its focus to the Middle East. Bush sent troops into Afghanistan and Iraq, totally derailing America's original playbook for China. Pouring resources into the Middle East took a heavy toll on American power. Because of this, the US just didn't have the bandwidth to go toe-to-toe with China in the Asia-Pacific. Working with China and keeping disagreements in check became the only realistic, if reluctant, option. That's exactly why Bush made multiple trips to China during his presidency. In 2008, he even brought his family to the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony and caught a US-China men's basketball game. During this window, relations between the two countries chilled out quite a bit. The turning point, the pivot to Asia. But things turned around pretty fast. In 2009, Barack Obama took the Oval Office and visited China. The two nations found common ground on global climate change, which eventually helped make the Paris Agreement happen. However, as the US wrestled with the fallout of the subprime mortgage crisis and China's GDP officially blew past Japan's in 2010 to become the world's second-largest economy, America had a wake-up call. They realized China was now a heavyweight contender. In 2011, Obama rolled out the pivot to Asia, moving 60% of US naval forces to the Asia-Pacific region and trying to squeeze China out economically with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. The US-China rivalry had officially begun. Still, they hadn't totally burned bridges. They kept the lines of communication open. In 2014, First Lady Michelle Obama visited China, which helped take the edge off the rising tensions. The trade war era. But that dynamic of competing while cooperating got thrown right out the window when Donald Trump took over. In 2017, President Trump visited China, and the two sides actually hammered out some trade deals at the Forbidden City. But just a few months later, Trump completely flipped the script. He pulled out Section 301, slapped massive tariffs on China, and set off a massive U.S. China trade war. That same year, the U.S. national security strategy officially labeled China as its #1 strategic rival. Trump used the anti-China narrative as a prime tool to distract from domestic issues and score political points. And that hostile legacy was picked up right where he left off by the Biden administration. In 2021, Joe Biden moved into the White House. He is the only U.S. president since the normalization of ties to never make an official visit to China. During his 4-year term, he pushed hard for the AUKUS security pact, handing over nuclear submarine tech to Australia. He also beefed up the Quad alliance and built a small-yard, high-fence strategy around cutting-edge tech like semiconductors. Basically, he tried to box China in across the board, economically, militarily, and technologically. To most politicians in Washington, U.S., China relations have crossed the point of no return into all-out competition. 2026. A new reality. Fast forward to today, 9 years into the trade war, and Trump is back in China. The big question is, what is he actually here to talk about? Maybe in Trump's original game plan, he figured he'd sort out Venezuela first, crush Iran, and lock down the Strait of Hormuz. Finally, he'd handle Cuba. Riding high on those 3 wins and holding the world's energy lifeline hostage, he'd strong-arm China into caving on the trade deficit and other issues. But reality didn't exactly play out the way he mapped it in his head. First off, his master plan hit a brick wall at step 2. The Iranian regime didn't just fold like he thought it would. Instead, they got a grip on the Strait of Hormuz, sending global energy prices through the roof. The temporary ceasefire they hashed out is basically dead on arrival. On May 7th, both sides started trading fire in the strait again. Iran is playing the U.S. through third-party channels and refusing to give an inch on core issues like uranium enrichment. The White House floated an overnight memo trying to break the deadlock, but so far nobody's agreeing to anything. Second, over the past 9 years of this trade war, China has built up a bulletproof pushback system. Leaning on a massive, complete industrial supply chain, China has been able to hit back at U.S. sanctions with pinpoint accuracy. The export controls on rare earth metals, for instance, had an instant, massive impact. On May 2nd, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a blocking statute, flat out forbidding anyone from recognizing, executing, or complying with U.S. sanctions on Chinese companies. China basically announced to the world that America's long-arm jurisdiction is completely useless on its turf. So, you've got the stalemate in Iran on one side, and China's rock-solid countermeasures on the other. This 1-2 punch totally blew up Trump's playbook, and that is exactly why, on this visit, Trump isn't throwing around arrogant threats or demanding sky-high concessions. He has to wake up and face reality. He's dealing with a China that's holding a lot more of the cards.